So now I want to invite up Thomas Wall, who is a professor here at Concordia in the cinema department. He's also on the Cinema Politica Board of Directors. He's always been a huge supporter of Cinema Politica. He's also the author of about 700 books. I think 650 of which have been written or are being written right now on everything from queer cinema to documentary to erotica to a lot of other amazing things. And he is going to come up and introduce our other guests right now. So I'll welcome Tom up here.
Welcome, everyone. This is so exciting. I can't believe we filled the room for a 25-year-old film. It is a great classic, one of the most influential documentaries of the 1990s. And it's a political film, and its politics grow with every screening. And so many of you were walking in saying that you hadn't seen it since you were a teenager. Well, here's another chance. So we have a very exciting evening lined up for you. When, on behalf of the School of Cinema and the Concordia Documentary Center and our research project in sexual representation and documentary, when we started to put this project together, we thought, how are we going to update this 25-year-old film? And we put out a few feelers to our friends at Couleur, which is a very exciting local group. That's Q-O-U-L-E-U-R-S, for those of you who are not members. And I will just describe their self-mandate. Couleur. We are your friends, lovers, allies, and cheerleaders. A grassroots group of artists, performers, writers, and political activists based in Montreal, Quebec, who have decided to volunteer their time and energy to bring, where's the lights around here? Okay. To bring I'm not in the millennium generation, obviously. Awareness of racialized queer identities and experiences to the wider public. We work to bridge the gaps between communities and create an open space for voices that all too often go unheard. Most of all, we want to have fun doing it. And we welcome people of color who self-identify as two-spirited, bisexual, gay, lesbian, queer, or trans to connect, celebrate, and be proud. So the result of these feelers was the decision to have something not on screen, but live, a live performance to open up the evening, to update the film for you, to tell us where the politics and the spectacle of this film are 25 years later. I would like to introduce you to Kama La Mackerel, a wonderful local performer, and I think you need no further introduction.
Well, hello. Good evening, everyone, ladies and gentlemen, queers and queers. My name is Professor La Mackerel. And today, I'm going to be teaching you a lesson. We're the new generation. We don't use that anymore. Here's my iPad. As a modern professor than I am. So, okay, I have a question to ask before I start. How many of you here have never seen this film? Okay, out of the people who raised their hands who have never seen this film, how many of you are straight? Okay, I mean, it's fine to let the straight people come out for once, right? We're always the ones doing it. So I'm saying this because if you're queer and you haven't seen this film, you're probably failing a core course in gay history. Somehow I have a feeling that anybody under 23 would fail this course anyway. Like, I actually went out on a date with a young twink the other day, and I mentioned the Stonewall riots, and he looked at me and said, "That's Nicki Minaj's latest album, right?" Don't go on dates with twinks on Grindr. So, the lecture today is titled 10 Lessons That I Learned from Paris is Burning. Lesson number 1, don't be shady, just fierce. What does that mean? Don't be shady, just fierce. This means when you get invited to give a lecture at Lucas Hilderbrand's book launch called Paris is Burning. Who is Hilderbrand anyway? I mean, have you ever heard of the House of Hilderbrand? Not me. And in any case, Lucas Hilderbrand is a really, really bad drag name. Like, you should try something like Hilderbrand New. You know, like Hilderbrand's new book. So what I just did right now was being shady. And what Paris is Burning teaches you is actually not to be shady, but to be fierce. So what does it mean to be fierce? I should have taken the notes instead. Okay. So to be fierce. To be fierce means to own it. To own it means politely turn towards Lucas and say, hey Lucas, I'm not gonna make fun of you, but I'm gonna tell you why I, a trashy drag queen, can tell you more about Paris is Burning than any academic can do. Lesson number 2. You can be whatever you want to be if you walk a ballroom. If Paris is Burning taught me something, it was that I could be whatever I wanted to be. If I walked a ballroom, like, I could give you sass, I could give you ass, I could give you daytime sports realness, I could give you nighttime sweaty realness, snow leopard realness, every single thing realness. Walking a ballroom allows you to be whatever you want to be. But more than anything, it gives you your moment of faith. I think this is falling. Yes? Can everybody hear me? I remember the old times where we just used to have seminars and not those fancy lectures with a mic and an iPad. That's kind of falling again. Maybe I just hold it in my hands. Okay, so your moment of fame. In the movie they call it over. It's like when you're over, you've made it. Like, it's your moment of fame. Maybe I'm just going to take this out. Okay. So, if Paris is Burning taught me something, is that I could be whatever I wanted to be if I walked a ballroom. But you know that English expression where you say, the world is my oyster? Right? The world is my freaking ballroom. And I can be whatever I want to be, whenever I want to be. And that's what Paris is Burning taught me. Lesson number 3. O-P-U-L-E-N-C-E. Opulence. I own everything. Lesson number 4. Pay attention and pay tribute. If there's one thing that Paris is Burning taught me, is that as much as I want to be, I'm not the center of the world. It's that if today, in 2013, I can step out of my house in stilettos wearing a leopard fur coat, if I can be out and about making out with random strangers on dance floors, grinding in parks and making babies and domestic partnerships and getting gay married and getting gay divorced, if I can sit in this hall at this public screening of Paris is Burning and have the honor and the pleasure of holding this book in my hands, it's because I have elders who have paved the way for me. We have ancestors, we have history, we have individuals and communities whom to thank, whom to be grateful for whom to pay tribute all the time. Because we owe it to them, and we owe it to ourselves. We stand and live on privileges that were granted to us by the likes of Venus Extravaganza, who lived and died, but whose names we should remember and honor. Lesson number 5, the overgrown orangutan. The few people who laugh actually watch the movie. If there's one cult scene in Paris is Burning that you'll see soon, and you should remember it, it's the one where Dorian Corey explains the difference between reading and throwing shade. If you don't know what that is, you'll learn it in a bit. At a particular moment, there's a shot of Venus Extravaganza reading Pedro, and it goes like this. Touch the skin, darling. Touch all of it. Touch all of this skin. Okay? You just can't take it. You're just an overgrown orangutan. Always remember that the overgrown orangutan, it's a species that inhabits every dark corner and lighted alleyway of our society. It's that species waiting out there to bring you down, and at any moment when it does, just touch yourself. As in, touch this skin, darling, touch this skin, and remember that the other is just an overgrown orangutan, or in certain cases, undergrown orangutans. Lesson number 6, having a house. Having a house, I will argue, is the most important part of the drag scene. Why? Why? Because lesson number 7, stand up for each other. Having a house means building a community, living in the community, fighting for each other, looking at each other, caring for each other, and standing up for each other. Having a house creates a physical, a psychological, and a spiritual space for healing. We might be living in 2013 in this wonderful cosmopolitan city that is Montreal, and yet many of us still deal with rejection from our biological families, from our classmates, from our colleagues, from the other gays in town. We still get cast aside because of racism, because of transphobia, because of misogyny. Nowadays, I hear academics, again academics, talking about queer families and queer bonding. Well, the house is the original queer family. The house is the original link of comfort that comes with choosing our community and living with them and for them and standing up for each other. Lesson number 8, shoulder pads and glitter. Now, I'm a kid of the 80s, so I didn't really need Paris is Burning to learn about shoulder pads. I mean, each time I close my eyes, I can just picture my mother with her massive shoulder pads. She was a really strong woman living in the 80s. Her strength came from her shoulder pads. But my mom wasn't really into glitter. And then I discovered somebody called Pepper La Beja. Now, if my mom had a baby with Pepper La Beja, it looked like this. Oh my God, I should ask myself questions about my father now. Lesson number 9, educate yourselves. If there's yet another lesson I learned from Paris is Burning, it is the importance of educating myself. And by this, I don't mean being a little privileged A-word with wealthy parents paying for their fees for them to attend an Ivy League. No. By educate yourselves, I really don't mean being book smart. I don't care how many theories you've read. I'm talking about education of the streets. I'm talking about being street smart, of knowing and acknowledging who you are, where you come from, of educating yourselves about the land and the culture where you live, of showing solidarity and care to others by learning to know them, by learning about their struggles, by learning about their loves and their heartbreaks. For this is what Paris is Burning teaches you, to educate yourselves and to emancipate yourselves. And speaking of education, lesson number 10. Reading! I expected more of a... If the queer audience here had seen Paris is Burning, everybody would have reacted better than that. So, I'm not going to tell you about reading. I'm going to show you some reading. Yeah? Should we do that? Yeah. I need you to... Okay, that's better. Please put on the music.
Zebra fucking cats. I'm on that bitch. 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 I'ma screw that bitch.
I'ma read that bitch. I'ma make an outline to the point y'all get. I'ma tell the whole school you a stupid bitch. Watch how fast we read that bitch. Watch my mouth, did you see that shit? I called you a slut, what you gonna do, bitch? I'ma read that bitch. I'ma read that bitch. I'ma take that bitch to college. I'ma give that bitch some knowledge. I'ma read that bitch. I'ma read that bitch. I'ma read, I'ma read, I'ma read. I'ma read, I'ma read, I'ma read. I'ma read that bitch. I'm that bitch. I'm that bitch. I'm that bitch. It's gonna be cohesive. It's gonna be my thesis. I'ma read that bitch. I'm that bitch. I'ma read, I'ma read, I'ma read. I'ma read, I'ma read, I'ma read. I'ma read that bitch. I'm that bitch. I'ma read, I'ma read, I'ma read. I'ma read, I'ma read, I'ma read. I'ma read that bitch. I'm that
Lucas Hilderbrand came here for this launch and this screening from Los Angeles. He's Associate Professor of Film Studies at University of California, Irvine. He's an academic, Cal. His first book was a wonderful book on the Karen Carpenter Super 8 movie, whose title I've blanked. Superstar! And it's been uphill ever since. So without further ado, Lucas, please come and introduce Paris is Burning. This is the book.
Thank you all for coming out this evening. I would like to first of all thank Tom Waugh for hosting me and for inviting me. We are all children in the House of Waugh. I'd also like to thank Antoine Damien for also facilitating and hosting, as well as Cinema Politica for having me here this evening. So I'm going to say a few words both about the book and about the film to set up the screening tonight. Oh, and also I would like to thank the professor for the reading lesson and for the Pepper LaBeija realness. This project actually started in this room. I don't know if Tom even remembers this, but the first time I presented any of this material was actually at a conference during Imagination. Is this? Can you hear me? I don't. Okay. So what the book actually began in many ways in this very room. I presented the first version of some of this research at a conference during Imagination. So I'm very happy to be back to launch the book here. So the film is a documentary made by Jenny Livingston. It was shot over the course of several years in the mid to late 1980s. Did the festival circuit in 1990, was released theatrically, and became a major critical and commercial success in 1991. And it was central to a moment that has been called the New Queer Cinema, which was a really exciting, dynamic, politicized moment when independent cinema was really sort of taken over by the queers. So films like Todd Haynes' Poison, Tom Kalin's Swoon, and this film were essentially sweeping the awards at various film festivals. And so there was this sort of critical moment and this critical mass of queer excitement, that queer cinema was the next thing, pushing boundaries in independent cinema. And each of these films were in many ways informed by the AIDS crisis and activist responses to AIDS. And they sort of employed the ethos and the strategies of AIDS activism within these films themselves. Paris is Burning would actually be one of the most commercially successful and certainly the most controversial of that wave of films. So in terms of the book itself, so I'll talk about the book briefly, and then I'll talk about the film. So the reason for writing the book is really twofold for me. On the one hand, it was a personally very formative film. I actually snuck into the theater when I was a teenager to see it. I wasn't, the ticket seller wouldn't actually sell me a ticket, so I had to actually sort of sneak in, buying a ticket for an R-rated movie, even though it sort of meant the same thing. And it's a film that has been part of my life ever since that moment. It really sort of opened my eyes and was sort of a film that sort of introduced me to sort of what queerness could be in a certain way, and it's something that has very much shaped my sense of the world and my sense of queer possibility, as well as sort of giving me sort of the first sort of critical lens on the various strategies of sort of living in opposition to sort of an oppressive capitalist culture. But it's also a film, sort of more generally, that I think has been extraordinarily important, and I would actually argue it's the most important queer film of the last 25 years. And it's a film that has entered the gay lexicon, the queer lexicon, in ways that I wanted to sort of explore in the book. So one of the challenges of writing the book was the challenge of writing about a film that's been formative, sort of treating it with love while also respecting the critiques of it. So sort of negotiating both love and rigor, sort of understanding and engaging the political responses without sort of destroying the object itself. Because it's a film I never wanted to hate, even if I understand some of the charged responses to it. The ballroom scene itself, the world of the balls, has continued and expanded in many ways, sort of being influenced by this film and perpetuating the growth of the ball world, and the categories and the genders have also shifted. So the ball world as it exists today isn't exactly what we see on screen tonight, but it's nonetheless the sort of ur-text for the next generations of ball walkers. So within the book itself, I had a couple of agendas. One was to situate the film historically within its context, including sort of the critical responses to the films. So if it's a film that you've been introduced to in college or graduate school, you no doubt know that it was a highly contentious film that prompted very sort of politicized and often sort of polemical responses in many ways. So I wanted to understand both the film in terms of what it was doing in its historical moment, as well as the responses to the film. Many of the writings of the film have been theoretical rather than historical, or sort of grounded in sort of situating these responses. The other thing that I wanted to do that was important to me was to examine the film's form itself, to understand what the film is actually doing, how it's constructed, how it's addressing audiences. And this is something that's actually been missing in much of the writing of the film, which has come from outside of film studies. So it's a film that has been incredibly important in critical race studies, queer theory, feminist studies. It's been almost entirely ignored within documentary studies, curiously. So I wanted to bring a film studies lens onto the film and examining what the film is doing. So the film itself. One of the things that I discovered in researching the film, and I was actually in dialogue with the filmmaker Jenny Livingston and the editor Jonathan Oppenheim in writing this book. And I think one of the most telling things I observed and found out through these conversations is that the director, Jenny Livingston, understood making this film as a process of collaboration with her subjects. So she was someone who had befriended and attended balls for a number of years, and she really understood the film as a collaboration. Jonathan Oppenheim, the editor, understood it as a film that he was trying to make accessible to outsiders. So he's someone who didn't identify with the ball scene. He's a straight white man, and so he was trying to construct a film that could speak to general audiences. And I think in many ways this is key to understanding the different readings that the film has generated. That the film is very much a negotiation between collaboration and making it accessible to outsiders. And I think in many ways the range of responses and the kinds of debates it's prompted are very much because of that dual address that the film has. I'm just going to read a passage from my favorite document that I found while doing research. Tom wanted me to do a reading in the hallway. I thought it'd be easier with a microphone. Okay. Speaking as an expert witness with an insider's view, as opposed to almost all the other mainstream film critics who foregrounded their status as outsiders to queer cultures of any kind, RuPaul reviewed the film for its home video release and observed that it quickly became part of the gay vernacular. Quote, "After Mahogany, Paris is Burning has got to be the #1 movie pick for any queen who's got her wig on straight. After our 6th viewing, we had most of the lines memorized, and it was like watching the Rocky Horror Picture Show," end quote. Who comprised RuPaul's we remains ambiguous, and Paris's elevation to cult film status could be seen as trivializing its social realism. But even in the case of Rocky Horror, the film matters to the people who invest in seeing it repeatedly, and a community develops through spectatorship. RuPaul concluded, quote, "In Paris is Burning, everybody's in drag, just like in real life," end quote. 2 decades later, Paris is Burning would be referenced repeatedly on RuPaul's reality competition series, RuPaul's Drag Race, arguably the most important queer text of the past decade. Okay. Yeah, so one of the things that I think is important to recognize, I think as you point out, is this question of language is very important, both within the film, but also in terms of in people's everyday lives, defining oneself and figuring out sort of the most appropriate language to sort of claim an identity. So one of the things I do address in the book is situating sort of the emergence of the term transgender as something that actually post-dates the footage in the film. So in Susan Stryker's transgender history, she suggests it's about 1990 that the term comes into parlance. So what we sort of may sort of understand to be transgender identity in this film actually wasn't a term in circulation, sort of particularly within these communities at this particular historical moment. So one of the difficult things in thinking through the film, I think, is that we don't have sort of the same language that they might have at that moment. One of the other things I think is actually really interesting, and it's something that Vivian Namaste and Jay Prosser and others have interrogated, is the ways in which trans identities have been very central to queer theory and gender theory, so rethinking what it means to have a gendered body in a certain way. And one of the things I think we see transition, initially in relation to this film, but then as the language evolves, is a transition from talking in terms of drag to talking in terms of transgender identity. So if we think about Judith Butler's early work, Gender Trouble, and then Bodies That Matter, sort of the terminology is drag rather than transgender, and eventually we see a transition in terms of the language. But there have also been studies of this community, particularly by David Valentine, that suggest that even once this term appears in academic and therapeutic situations, that in many cases the women and men don't actually take on that term, that they still identify as gay and female. And so they're sort of, again, sort of using their own language and own terms to define themselves. But it's a great question. Thank you. One of the major critiques of the film is that it is actually reinforcing the dominant capitalist ideologies. And that the film, as a documentary, is oftentimes perceived to endorse those values as opposed to critique them. So one of the things I think is actually quite important to understand as well is the genre of documentary it is, which is it's a cinema verite film. So it's a film that is comprised using interview footage, documentation, but it doesn't have voiceover, it doesn't tell the audience what to think, and it doesn't sort of tell the audience necessarily what position to take. So one of the things that I think as well contributes to sort of the range of responses, including the sense that it's actually sort of a reactionary film as opposed to a progressive film, is that the film doesn't tell you what position to take in terms of reading capitalism. But I will say a number of audiences have actually found that it's a film that very much sort of exposes these values and sort of opens them up to critique in ways that we can sort of begin to see through them as well. I think one of the most interesting ways to sort of think about the ways that the film has actually changed in meaning or evolved in meaning is if we look at the academic theoretical responses to it. So one of the terms that was central to the early debates was this question of whether or not the film is subversive, largely coming again out of Judith Butler's reading of drag. So the debates were about whether or not it's subversive, and many people felt it wasn't subversive. But what we see is that as more queer men of color, authors begin looking at it, and even sort of Judith Butler's own return to it, the discourse actually shifts from subversion to survival. And that sort of this film is less about trying to change the capitalist structures, knowing that that is sort of fully impossible, but rather it's about sort of finding ways to live and make life livable. So that's really sort of one of the things that I think is really important to understand in terms of the ways that this film has been interpreted. And I think a lot of times when the film is taught, the very earliest writings are still taught, and some of that later work, which I think is actually much richer, sort of has sort of fallen sort of under people's radar. But it's a great question, yeah. And I will say, yeah, the Christopher Street Piers, where much of it is shot under the billionaire mayor Bloomberg, has been renovated and sort of looks nothing like this. So sort of the physical traces of New York City aren't there anymore. And even Washington Square Park, they've changed. They actually moved the fountain again, sort of to appease the property owners. One of the sort of, among the critiques that is offered at the film is that it doesn't address AIDS directly enough. So it's mentioned a couple of times in passing. And I did talk to Ginny about that. And her response was that at the time that they were shooting, as far as they knew, none of those subjects were HIV positive. And they didn't want to insert an AIDS character in order for that to sort of be a tokenized representation within the film. So part of it was sort of working with the materials they had, and rather than sort of wedge the social issues into it, sort of they wanted to sort of celebrate what they were documenting. But what I'll also say about it is that if you saw this film in New York City, or really any place in the world in 1990, 1991, you wouldn't have needed to be told that AIDS existed. It was so much part of the culture and so much part of the discourse that context was obvious and evident in certain ways. And in many ways, I think sort of part of the joy of this film was that it was a representation of queer life that wasn't reduced to or defined or overdetermined by AIDS in certain ways. That said, some of the earliest screenings of it were actually benefits and premieres for AIDS organizations. So both the Los Angeles and the Detroit premieres were AIDS benefits. So it was something that was part of the framing context, even if it's minimally mentioned in the film itself. Some of the ball participants were drug users, but I think Ginny didn't want to go there. So yeah, certainly the question of language and the intertitles was something that was debated in the early responses to the film. So there's both a very famous essay by Jackie Goldsby called Queens of Language, which is looking at sort of structures of language in the film. But also one of the major critiques of Ginny Livingston as a filmmaker was to call her an ethnographer. And one of the things that that was considered to be sort of in service of this kind of positioning was the use of terminology sort of as though you need sort of a guide into this world through to understand the language. And one of the claims is that the structure is about sort of making this world seem more exotic because it has to be named, it has to be explained in a certain way. That's a critique I actually think is ridiculous. Just because sort of it is a world in which, or a culture in which sort of its own vernacular has emerged, and sort of if we don't understand the terms, then how are we supposed to understand sort of the meanings that they're making and the uses of language within that? But I would also say it's also about feuds between the social sciences and the humanities. So to call something ethnographic as something damning, I think says more about the humanities than it says about the social sciences. So.